on this day, the 8th of November 1939, Hitler almost died. On this day in the beer cellar in Munich, the same place in 1923 where Hitler had attempted the putsch against the German government in his attempts to take over back then. It had failed and he had gone to prison where he had written Mein Kampf. Every year since, he had gone back to celebrate the beer hall putsch. In 1939, 13 minutes after he left the hall after giving his 1-hour speech, a bomb exploded, killing 8 and injuring 62. If he had remained for another 13 minutes, he, along with Himmler, injuring, and some others, may have died. And if that had happened at this time, 8th of November 1939, only 2 months after the war had begun, history could have been changed utterly. So what happened on that day? And how is it connected to the events of the next day in Venlo, in the Netherlands? This is what we're going to look at today. George Elser, a German, who many times throughout his life had leant towards the left, had been involved with communists, had voted for the communists in Germany, but he hadn't been that organized with the communists. He hadn't been plotting with the communists. He hadn't been told by the communists to do anything. He was, you could say, he voted for them. He voted generally for leftists. He considered himself a leftist, but he wasn't a part of organized labor. And he hated the Nazis. He hated Hitler. In 1938, George Elser had gone to Munich because he wanted to see Hitler. He wanted to hear him speak at the beer hall. Not because he liked him, because he had an idea forming in his head. He wanted to stop him. A few days after Hitler's speech to the beer hall, the Kristallnacht pogroms began. At this point, George Elser knew he needed to do something. He got himself a job in an armaments factory. He started pilfering gunpowder. He started researching how to build a bomb. And he spent a year going through what he was going to do in 1939. This is before the war began. So, when 8th of November 1939 came about, everything had been planned, but Hitler had cancelled his trip to the beer cellar. At the last minute, he said he was going to go. So this is quite a long and complicated plot. Quite a dedicated man, this man George was. He was living in Switzerland with his wife and child, but he went back into Germany and spent months in Munich, going to this beer cellar every day and sneaking into the beer hall and staying there all night. He would do a couple of hours work. He would dig into the pillar behind where speakers would be standing, and bit by bit he cleared a hole big enough for his planned bomb. By the time Hitler was standing there, He'd been months there. He'd built the bomb. He'd tested it out. There was a timer on it. Everything was ready. He had gone back specifically to check it out a few days before the planned speech, just to make sure that it was still working. And then he left. And he attempted to get back into Switzerland, but unfortunately for him, he had some suspicious items on him, a few wires, and various other tools that normal people probably wouldn't have. Various items that seemed a bit suspicious, and at this point the border guards didn't even know that there had been an attempt on Hitler's life. If he had just got rid of this stuff out of his pockets, he could have crossed the border a couple of hours before they would have known what was going on. But he made some big mistakes, and he ended up having to be transported to Berlin to be questioned and tortured and the usual things. Now, a day after this attempted assassination, which could have changed the whole of history, German troops crossed in, well, German troops, German Gestapo, you could say. They crossed in to the Netherlands and kidnapped 2 British agents just 16 feet from the German frontier. There was a bit of a shootout. Someone died, but it seems as if the Germans wanted to capture these 2 fellas, Best and Stevens, because they wanted to have them to question them about various plots that were going on to try to remove Hitler. So it seems that these 2 agents, Best and Stevens, were being tricked by double agents, German double agents, who were pretending to be in a plot against Hitler, and they kept on telling them to come to this place Venlo, very near the German frontier, and they wanted to kidnap them to then question them about other plots that were against Hitler. So there was the whole double agent thing. But at the time, they blamed these 2 agents as being involved in the plot against Hitler's life. And they said that the British were involved. Now they weren't, which is amazing, because if they had given George Esler some assistance, pretty sure he could have done it. He was very near to getting it done. So they kidnapped these 2 fellas. The whole plot, the bomb and the Venlo incident, are blamed on Britain. Venlo is in the Netherlands, so they breached Dutch sovereignty at the time. The Germans turned it around and said the British came into Germany and they were arrested just within the borders, because obviously when you're telling your story, you're always the good guy. Now, these fellas were also put in concentration camps and prisons and questioned, and I'm imagining they were tortured. And what's interesting about this is at the very end of the war, because this George Esler actually lived until 1945. They didn't actually execute him until that time. But these 2 fellas, Best and Stevens, were transported from camp to camp to camp. So they were in Berlin at first, then they went sent to Sachsenhausen, then they went to Dachau, and they went somewhere else, and they went back to Dachau, and they arrived 9th of April in Dachau. And that was the very same day that George Elser was executed in Dachau, which is a weird kind of circle, how this all came together. So even though these 2 events were not connected, they were said to be connected back in 1939. They blamed George Elser for being in bed with these 2 agents, Best and Stevens, even though they had nothing to do with each other. At the very end of the war, Best and Stevens were transported into Dachau on the very same day that poor old George Elser was executed. So there was a weird rhyme and rhythm to this. And the agents eventually, they were marched out of Dachau, and they were liberated by some American troops in Tyrol later on. But poor old George Elsler, 1 month before the war ends, and he's executed. Poor fella. But he did try. And he did say, at the very end, that one of the reasons he did this was because he couldn't just not do anything. He had to himself do something to try to stop what he saw as the disaster that was going to be happening. So, on this day, 8th of November 1939, George Elsler's bomb explodes 13 minutes after Hitler left the beer hall. If this bomb had gone off 20 minutes earlier, the entire history of the world could have been very different. Okay, if you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Subscribe, leave a comment, and like.